The night that just passed over the Middle East was not a battle, it was a verdict. A verdict delivered not in a courtroom, not across a diplomatic table, but written in fire across the skies of northern Israel and felt in the trembling corridors of the Pentagon thousands of miles away. When the first salvos left their launch rails in the early hours of this morning, the world was still operating under a set of assumptions that had governed regional security thinking for more than 3 decades. By the time the last contrail faded from the horizon, every single one of those assumptions had been reduced to ash. 300 missiles and kamikaze drone systems were unleashed in a coordinated strike package of a precision and scale that no Western defense analyst had publicly projected as operationally feasible for Iran at this stage. The target was not symbolic. The target was functional, deliberate, and chosen with the cold logic of a military command that has spent years mapping every vulnerability in Israel's defensive architecture. Natim Air Base, the primary operating facility for Israel's fleet of F-35 IADR stealth fighters, the crown jewel of the IDF's air superiority doctrine, and the single most expensive military investment the Israeli state has ever made, absorbed direct hits that sent columns of black smoke climbing into the morning sky, visible from 40 kilometers away. But the destruction of hangars and aircraft was only the surface of what happened tonight. The deeper catastrophe for Tel Aviv was the systematic exposure of Iron Dome, the technological mythology that Israel and its Western backers had spent billions of dollars and decades of propaganda constructing as an impenetrable wall between Israeli civilians and any conceivable threat. Tonight, that wall was not breached, it was demolished. Of the 300 inbound targets, fewer than 200 were intercepted. 100 projectiles reached their designated impact points. The mathematics of that failure will haunt Israeli defense planners for a generation. And then there was the moment that crystallized everything. The moment that transformed a military engagement into a geopolitical earthquake. As Iranian strike packages were still tracking toward their targets, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group and accompanying vessels quietly began increasing their distance from the Gulf of Oman. No announcement, no press conference, just the sound of enormous turbines accelerating away from a theater that the United States Navy had always treated as its sovereign operating space. The world's most expensive symbols of American military dominance were repositioning not toward the fight, but away from it. Tonight's analysis will cut through every layer of official narrative to show you exactly what happened, why it happened, and what it means for a region and a world that will never look quite the same again. Before we go deeper into the most consequential military night the Middle East has seen in decades, take 5 seconds and hit subscribe. Every analysis on this channel goes where mainstream coverage refuses to go into the actual mechanics of power, the real numbers behind the headlines, and the strategic logic that governments don't want explained clearly. Hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening, and drop your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. Now let's get into it. Tonight's breakdown will answer 4 questions that no official source will address directly. First, how did a military base housing the most advanced stealth fighters on the planet get hit by an adversary that Western analysts have spent years describing as technologically outmatched? Second, what does it actually mean when Iron Dome, a system that absorbed more than $1 billion in American taxpayer funding, fails to stop 1 in 3 incoming targets during a coordinated strike? Third, at what precise moment did the United States Navy calculate that staying in the Gulf of Oman was no longer a viable option? And what does that calculation reveal about the real limits of American power projection in 2025? And fourth is what we witnessed tonight, the opening chapter of a permanent realignment of Middle Eastern power, or just the most dramatic episode yet in a conflict that still has further to escalate. The answers will reframe everything you thought you understood about who controls this region. Part 1, the strike that rewrote the rules. To understand what happened at Nevatim Air Base in the early hours of this morning, you have to understand what Nevatim represents inside the IDF strategic doctrine. This is not simply another military installation. Nevatim is the operational home of Israel's F-35 IADR fleet, 50-plus fifth-generation stealth aircraft that represent the single most significant qualitative military advantage Israel holds over every adversary in its regional environment. These are not defensive platforms. The F-35I is a first-strike weapon designed to penetrate denied airspace, deliver precision munitions against hardened targets, and return without being detected. Israel's entire offensive strategic posture, including any contemplated strike against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, flows through Nevatim. Destroy the aircraft at Nevatim. And you don't just damage the IDF, you surgically remove its capacity for the kind of long-range offensive operations that have defined Israeli military doctrine for the past 2 decades. Iran knew exactly what it was targeting. This was not a base chosen for symbolic value or psychological impact. It was chosen because eliminating or significantly degrading the F-35 fleet changes the entire military balance of the region in a single operational sequence. The targeting intelligence that made this strike possible represents years of patient collection analysis and refinement of sustained intelligence effort that Israeli and American security services failed to detect, interdict, or disrupt in time to matter. The strike architecture itself was a masterpiece of layered operational design. The opening phase deployed a dense swarm of low-cost decoy UAV systems produced in IRGC manufacturing facilities at a fraction of the per-unit cost of the interceptors they were designed to consume. These decoys were not intended to cause damage. Their sole purpose was to force every battery of Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow interceptors in the northern and central sectors to activate, to burn through their ready-to-fire magazines, and to saturate the processing capacity of the command and control computers managing the intercept sequence. When a radar system is simultaneously tracking 200-plus inbound signatures and the fire control algorithm is allocating interceptors against each one, the computational load approaches the design ceiling of the system. Response times extend, prioritization errors increase, and the gaps that open in the coverage matrix are not random. They are the predictable result of an adversary who has studied the system's behavior under saturation conditions for years. Into those gaps came the second wave. Precision-guided ballistic missiles carrying warheads calibrated for hardened infrastructure, reinforced hangar doors, fuel and munitions, storage facilities, radar and communications nodes. These were not weapons fired in the general direction of a target and adjusted post-impact. They were weapons assigned to specific GPS coordinates, flying terminal guidance profiles that made last evasive maneuvers to defeat the interceptors that managed to engage them. The combination of the decoy saturation phase and the precision follow-on strike was not improvised. It was a rehearsed operational sequence that had been developed, refined, and wargamed over an extended period. The results at Nevatim were captured first, not by military reconnaissance assets, but by the smartphones of Israeli civilians living in communities within visual range of the base. Video circulating within minutes of the strike showed multiple impact points across the installation, secondary explosions consistent with munitions, storage penetration, and fires that the base's own suppression systems were visibly unable to contain. The IDF's initial response was silence, which in Israeli military communications culture is itself a signal of the magnitude of what had occurred. Official acknowledgement followed hours later in language so carefully hedged as to be operationally meaningless, confirming only that there had been impacts without specifying what had been hit or the extent of the damage. Alongside Needham, the strike package targeted a second tier of critical infrastructure, radar installations providing early warning coverage across Israel's eastern and northern approach corridors were hit in a sequencing designed to degrade the IDF's situational awareness for any follow-on operations. Power distribution nodes serving military facilities in the NEV region absorbed impacts that triggered cascading outages, and intelligence infrastructure, the sensor and communications network that underpins Israel's ability to track, attribute, and respond to threats, was targeted in ways that suggest a level of knowledge about Israeli classified infrastructure that will generate serious internal security reviews in the weeks ahead. The operational conclusion that serious military analysts are already drawing from this single night is stark and unavoidable. Iran executed a complex multi-axis precision strike campaign against hardened military targets inside one of the most heavily defended territories on the planet, achieved meaningful penetration of that defense architecture, and inflicted measurable damage on the most strategically significant military assets its adversary possesses. That is not the performance of a military organization that Western analysts have characterized as chronically limited by sanctions, brain drain, and technological isolation. That is the performance of a military organization that has been preparing for this specific mission for a very long time. Part 2, the weapons that made the impossible routine. The technical story of tonight's strike begins not with the missiles themselves, but with the decision Iran made decades ago. The decision to treat Western sanctions not as a ceiling on Iranian capability, but as an engineering specification. Every component that foreign suppliers refused to provide became a design problem to be solved domestically. Every technology that export controls placed off limits became a research priority for Iranian defense engineers working inside a system that rewarded innovation because it had no alternative. The result visible in the strike packages that flew tonight is a defense industrial base that is genuinely self-sufficient across the full spectrum of capabilities required for the kind of campaign that was executed against Nevatim and associated targets. The primary strike weapon in tonight's package was the Khaibar Shaken, a ballistic missile whose designation translates directly as fortress breaker, a name that turned out to be operationally accurate in the most literal sense. The Khaibar Shakan belongs to the fourth generation of Iranian ballistic missile development, and the distance between this system and the Scud derivative weapons that Iran was deploying in the 1980s and 1990s is roughly equivalent to the distance between a propeller-driven aircraft and a modern jet fighter. The guidance architecture uses a combination of inertial navigation, terrain reference navigation, and in the terminal phase, an active optical or radar seeker that allows the warhead to identify and track its designated aim point independently of external signals. This matters enormously because it means the guidance system cannot be defeated by GPS jamming, a countermeasure that American forces attempted to deploy tonight and that produced no measurable degradation in Iranian strike accuracy. The terminal phase flight profile of the Khyber-Shehan introduces what defense engineers call maneuvering re-entry vehicle behavior. The warhead does not fall along a predictable ballistic arc in its final seconds of flight. It executes lateral and vertical maneuvers at hypersonic velocities, changing its approach angle and trajectory in ways that defeat the lead angle prediction algorithms that Patriot and Arrow interceptors depend on for successful engagement. To intercept a maneuvering re-entry vehicle, a defensive missile must not aim at where the target is. It must aim at where the target will be when the interceptor arrives. If the target changes its position unpredictably during that intercept window, the defensive missile misses. The Khyber-Sheikh was specifically engineered to exploit that vulnerability, and tonight's interception failure rate confirmed that the engineering succeeded. Alongside the ballistic component, the strike package integrated the Shahid series loitering munitions in a configuration that demonstrated significant evolution from the systems that first attracted international attention in earlier conflict cycles. Tonight's Shahid variants incorporated what appears to be an upgraded navigation package and a modified approach profile designed to reduce radar detectability in the terminal phase, flying at altitudes that place them below the optimal engagement envelope of many area defense systems, and approaching from vectors that exploit terrain masking in the complex geography of the negative and northern negative transition zones. These systems function not merely as weapons, but as mobile, autonomous targeting platforms that could adjust their approach in response to the electromagnetic environment they encountered en route. The cost asymmetry embedded in this weapons mix deserves extended attention because it is the financial engine that drives the entire strategic logic of Iran's approach. A Khyber missile costs Iran approximately $500,000 to $800,000 to produce, an estimate that factors in the amortized cost of the domestic industrial infrastructure required manufacturing. A Tamira interceptor missile fired from an Iron Dome battery carries a unit acquisition cost of $40,000 to $50,000. But to achieve a reliable probability of kill against a single maneuvering target, doctrine requires firing two interceptors simultaneously, bringing the intercept cost to $80,000 to $100, 000 per engagement. Against a ballistic threat requiring engagement by David Slinger Arrow, the interceptor cost climbs to between $1 million and $3.50 million per round. When Iran fires 300 mixed targets in a single operational sequence, and Israel is forced to engage each one through its layered defense architecture, the per-nate cost differential runs into hundreds of millions of dollars, with Iran spending a fraction of what Israel must expend simply to sustain its defensive posture. This is the economic kill chain that Iran's military planners have constructed with the same deliberate precision they applied to the kinetic design of the strike itself. The goal is not to achieve military victory in a single exchange. The goal is to impose a rate of resource consumption on the defender that cannot be sustained across the duration of a protracted conflict, and to do so at a cost to the attacker that is low enough to maintain operational tempo indefinitely. Israel's interceptor magazines are finite. The production lines that replenish them operate on timescales measured in months, not days. And the American resupply pipeline, while substantial, carries its own political and logistical constraints that become more visible with each passing week of high-intensity operations. The self-sufficiency dimension of Iran's weapons capability is not incidental to this story. It is central to it. When Western governments imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iran's defense sector, the implicit theory was that technological isolation would degrade Iranian military capability to a level where it posed no serious threat to American or Israeli strategic interests. That theory has been falsified completely and publicly tonight. The missile that hit Nevada's F-35 hangars was designed by Iranian engineers, manufactured in Iranian factories using Iranian materials, guided by Iranian software running on Iranian-produced hardware. No component of that weapon system required the cooperation or tolerance of any Western government or corporation. The sanctions regime that was supposed to prevent this moment did not prevent it. It accelerated it by forcing Iran to build a domestic industrial debt that now makes its military capability genuinely sanction-proof. Part 3. Washington blinks. The carrier groups retreat. There is a moment in every geopolitical era when the instruments of power that defined the previous period reveal their limits in a way that cannot be obscured or explained away. For the American century, that instrument has been the Carrier Strike Group, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier surrounded by a constellation of guided missile cruisers, destroyers, attack submarines, and support vessels capable of projecting air power across a radius of hundreds of miles and carrying enough ordnance to conduct sustained combat operations for weeks without resupply. Since the end of the Second World War, the movement of American carrier groups has been the primary language through which Washington communicates its intentions, its commitments, and its warnings to every government on the planet. When a carrier group moves toward a crisis, it means America is engaged. When it moves away, it means something else entirely. Tonight, 2 carrier strike groups moved away. The repositioning of naval assets from the Gulf of Oman was not announced in a Pentagon press briefing. It was not framed as a strategic redeployment or a scheduled rotation. It emerged from the combination of commercial satellite imagery, signals, intelligence reporting from regional sources, and the observations of maritime tracking services that monitor vessel movements across the Indo-Pacific and Arabian Sea. The ships moved, they moved at speed, and they moved in a direction that increased their distance from Iranian anti-ship missile engagement envelopes rather than decreasing it. To understand why this happened, you have to understand what Iran has built in the waters and coastal geographies surrounding the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman over the past 15 years. The doctrine is called anti-access area denial, a military strategy designed not to defeat an adversary in open battle, but to make the cost of entering and operating within a defined geographic zone prohibitively high. Iran's a two-way architecture in this region is among the most developed and layered in the world, combining multiple overlapping threat systems that collectively cover every approach vector available to a surface naval force. At the outer layer sits Iran's inventory of long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles, most critically the Khagfars and its derivatives, which represent a category of weapon that the United States Navy has no historical experience defending against in a live combat environment. Anti-Hus ship ballistic missiles fly a trajectory that takes them to high altitude before diving steeply onto their target in the terminal phase, approaching from above rather than from the horizon, which is the attack geometry that American naval air defense systems are optimized to defeat. The combination of high terminal velocity, steep dive angle, and maneuvering guidance makes these weapons extraordinarily difficult to engage with standard naval interceptors. A carrier strike group sitting within range of these systems is not in a safe operating environment. Inside that outer layer sits Iran's inventory of anti-ship cruise missiles, sea-skimming weapons that fly at very low altitude to defeat radar detection, arriving at their targets with minimal warning time. These systems are deployed from multiple platforms, surface vessels, submarines, coastal launch batteries, and aircraft. The layered multi-axis nature of the cruise missile threat means that a carrier strike group's defensive screen, however sophisticated, must simultaneously track and engage threats arriving from different directions, at different altitudes, and at different speeds. Saturating that defensive screen is precisely the tactical problem that Iran has spent years engineering solutions for. At the innermost layer of the A2AD architecture sit Iran's fast attack craft and submarine forces' unconventional naval assets that operate in the shallow, geographically complex waters of the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman in ways that exploit the limitations of large platform naval warfare. Swarms of fast attack craft armed with anti-ship missiles and torpedoes operating in coordination with shore-based fires and air support can impose costs on a conventional naval force that vastly exceed the value of the assets being protected. Iranian submarine forces, while not technically competitive with American nuclear submarines in open ocean warfare, are highly effective in the shallow, confined waters of the Gulf, where acoustic conditions degrade American sonar performance and the geography provides natural concealment. When the tactical officers aboard American carrier groups ran their threat assessment calculations on the night of Iran's strike against Nevada, the picture that emerged was not ambiguous. The Gulf of Oman, in the current threat environment with Iranian A2AD systems at elevated readiness, and Iran's willingness to accept escalation, clearly demonstrated by the scale of the Nevada strike, had become a zone where the risk to irreplaceable strategic assets exceeded any reasonable operational justification for remaining. The carriers are not simply military tools. They are symbols of American commitment and credibility whose loss would carry consequences far beyond their replacement cost. Losing a carrier to Iranian anti-ship missiles in the Gulf of Oman would be the most catastrophic single blow to American global prestige since the fall of Saigon. The decision to reposition was not cowardice. It was a rational calculation by professional military officers who understood that the environment had changed in ways that made the previous positioning untenable. But rational or not, the strategic consequences of that repositioning are severe and immediate. Every government in the region watched those ships move. Every government drew the same conclusion that American security guarantees in the Middle East carry conditions that were not previously disclosed, and that those conditions include a threshold of Iranian military capability beyond which American forward presence will be adjusted rather than reinforced. For the Gulf states that have oriented their entire security architecture around American protection, this is not an abstract geopolitical observation. It is an existential reassessment investment that will drive concrete policy changes in the months ahead. For Israel, the implications are even more direct. The carrier groups were positioned in the region explicitly to deter Iranian escalation and to provide Israel with the assurance that American military power stood behind its security commitments. That assurance has now been empirically tested and found to carry limits that Israel's government had not factored into its strategic planning. The F-35s burning at Nevatim were not saved by American intervention. The command and control nodes that were hit were not protected by American electronic warfare support. Israel fought this night largely alone with American assistance, constrained to intelligence sharing and the political cover of diplomatic statements, neither of which stopped a single Iranian missile. Part 4, the will that weapons cannot buy. There is a quality of military effectiveness that no defense budget can purchase and no alliance relationship can transfer. It cannot be downloaded as a software update or delivered on a resupply flight from a foreign airbase. It is the quality that Iranian military forces demonstrated tonight in every phase of the operation, from the patient years of preparation that preceded the strike to the disciplined execution that unfolded across the operational sequence. And it is the quality that explains why Iran, operating under the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a nation state, has produced a military capability that forced the United States Navy out of its preferred operating position. That quality is strategic clarity, the complete alignment between a nation's understanding of why it is fighting, what it is fighting for, and what it is willing to sacrifice to achieve its objectives. When that alignment exists at every level of a military organization, from the engineers who designed the guidance systems to the soldiers who operated the launch batteries tonight, the resulting combat effectiveness exceeds what any purely technical analysis of hardware and inventory numbers would predict. When it is absent, when soldiers are fighting for an abstraction, for an alliance relationship, for a political commitment made by a foreign government, the performance ceiling is fundamentally lower, regardless of the quality of the equipment involved. Iran has been in a state of existential confrontation with the American-Israeli security architecture in the Middle East for more than 4 decades. In that time, it has absorbed the assassination of its nuclear scientists, the destruction of its industrial facilities through cyber warfare operations, the killing of its most celebrated military commanders, and the progressive tightening of an economic stranglehold that has touched every aspect of civilian life. Each of these actions was intended to either break Iran's will to resist or degrade its capacity to do so. Each of them failed, and each failure made the Iranian military establishment more determined, more technically capable, and more operationally sophisticated than it had been before. The soldiers who operated the Khyber-Shakhan launch systems tonight were not fighting for a paycheck or a foreign policy abstraction. They were fighting in defense of a civilization that has been under continuous external pressure for their entire lifetimes. They were fighting to demonstrate that the sanctions, the assassinations, the cyber attacks, and the endless cycles of diplomatic humiliation had not achieved what they were designed to achieve. They were fighting to prove to themselves, to their adversaries, and to the watching world that a nation with genuine sovereignty and genuine internal cohesion cannot be defeated by any combination of external pressure short of outright annihilation. Compare this motivational architecture to the one operating on the Israeli side of tonight's exchange. Israel's military power, while technically formidable, rests on a foundation that has a structural fragility that becomes visible under sustained pressure. The IDF's equipment is largely American in origin or American in funding. Its most capable offensive platform, the F-35, exist because the United States provided it and continues to provide the parts, software updates, and technical support required to keep it operational. Its air defense architecture was co-developed with American partners and depends on American resupply to maintain its interceptor magazines. Even its intelligence capabilities, while independently operated, are deeply intertwined with American satellite and signals intelligence infrastructure. This dependency is not a secret, as rarely defense officials understand it and manage it carefully in normal conditions. But tonight was not normal conditions. Tonight was a moment of maximum pressure when the depth of that dependency was fully exposed in real time. The F-35s at Nevatim could not take off and respond to the attack that was destroying their base because the base itself was the target. The interceptors that were supposed to protect those aircraft ran out before the strike packages did. And the superpower that Israel had always counted on to fill those gaps was calculating its own risk exposure and choosing a more conservative position rather than reinforcing the embattled ally. The contrast between Iran's self-sufficiency and Israel's structural dependency is not merely a talking point. It is the operational explanation for the outcome of tonight's engagement. A military force that depends on its own society for everything it needs. Its weapons, its doctrine, its motivation, its political mandate fights differently than a military force whose sustainability is contingent on the continued goodwill of a foreign patron. When the foreign patron's calculus changes, the dependent force's options narrow dramatically. when Iran's patron calculus has never been a factor because Iran builds what it needs internally, that constraint simply does not exist. Part 5, the world order that burned tonight. Step back from the immediate military details of tonight's engagement and look at the structural picture that has been revealed. What we witnessed was not simply Iran conducting a large-scale strike against Israeli military infrastructure. What we witnessed was the operational proof of a thesis about the nature of power in the contemporary international system, a thesis that has been building for years across multiple theaters and multiple domains, and that tonight received its most unambiguous confirmation yet. The thesis is this: the unipolar moment, the period following the Cold War during which American military, economic and normative dominance was sufficient to determine outcomes across every significant international security situation, is over, not fading, not declining, over. The events of tonight in the skies over Israel and the waters of the Gulf of Oman constitute empirical evidence for this conclusion that cannot be dismissed as rhetoric or wishful thinking by American adversaries. They are data points that every government in the world will incorporate into its strategic assessments for years to come. The instrument through which American dominance expressed itself most visibly and most coercively in the Middle East has been the carrier strike group. When a crisis emerged anywhere in the region, Washington deployed carriers, and the implicit threat of American air power hanging over every calculation produced compliance, deference, and a general suppression of adversarial action. This mechanism worked because it was credible, because no regional actor possessed the capability to impose unacceptable costs on American naval forces operating in the region's waters. Tonight, Iran demonstrated that it possesses exactly that capability. The repositioning of American carriers in response to Iranian A2A activation is the visible marker of a credibility threshold being crossed, a moment after which the mechanism of carrier-based deterrence in this specific theater operates under conditions it was not designed to manage. For Moscow and Beijing, tonight's events carry a quality of strategic confirmation that their long-term investment in the multipolar project has been vindicated. Russia's defense cooperation with Iran, spanning technology transfer, training, intelligence sharing, and the diplomatic cover that Russian Security Council vetoes have provided against Western-sponsored sanctions tightening, has contributed materially to the capability that was demonstrated tonight. The Russian calculation has always been that a Middle East in which American dominance is contested is a Middle East in which Russian strategic leverage is enhanced, and that calculation has paid a substantial dividend in the last 24 hours. Chinese strategic patience, the sustained cultivation of economic relationships across the region, the infrastructure investments, the quiet technology cooperation is also positioned to yield returns as the regional order rebalances away from its previous American-centric configuration. The Gulf states are watching this moment with a mixture of anxiety and recalibration. For decades, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain have maintained their security within a framework that assumed American protection as a near absolute guarantee. The events of tonight, and specifically the visible adjustment of American naval positioning, will accelerate conversations that were already underway about strategic diversification, about maintaining independent deterrent capabilities, and about the wisdom of maintaining an exclusively American-dependent security architecture in a region where the relevant power dynamics are clearly shifting. The broader global South, the constellation of developing nations that have chafed under decades of Western-imposed economic and political frameworks, will draw their own conclusions from tonight's demonstration. The message that Iran's performance transmits to every government that has faced American coercive diplomacy, sanctions, pressure, or military threat is straightforward and powerful. Self-sufficiency is achievable, deterrence is buildable, and the assumption that Western technological superiority will always translate into operational dominance in every environment is a myth that has now been visibly debunked. The old order in the Middle East was built on several interlocking pillars: Israeli qualitative military superiority over every regional adversary, American power projection capacity sufficient to deter any challenge to that superiority, and a diplomatic framework that kept Iranian power contained within limits acceptable to the American-Israeli axis. Tonight, each of those pillars was stress-tested simultaneously, and each showed fractures that will not be repaired by the next resupply flight from Andrews Air Force Base or the next emergent session of the UN Security Council. A new order is beginning to take shape in the space left by the fracturing of the old one. Its contours are not yet fully visible, but several features are already clear. It will be more multipolar than its predecessor, with Iran, Turkey, and potentially Saudi Arabia operating as genuine autonomous power centers rather than subordinate actors within an American-managed framework. It will be more contested technologically with the diffusion of precision strike capability, making the previous assumption of Western technological monopoly permanently obsolete, and it will be shaped significantly by the choices that Iran makes in the coming weeks and months about how to consolidate the strategic position it has established through tonight's demonstration. The question that will define the next phase of Middle Eastern history is not whether Iran has the capability to reshape the regional order tonight, prove that it does. The question is whether the other actors in this environment, Israel, the United States, the Gulf states, and the broader international community, will adapt their strategic frameworks to the new reality quickly enough to prevent the transition from the old order to the new one from passing through a phase of catastrophic general conflict. The history of hegemonic transitions does not offer a reassuring template, but the actors involved have more information, more communication channels, and more mutual awareness of catastrophic risk than their historical predecessors. Whether that awareness will translate into the kind of strategic restraint that a managed transition requires remains the most important open question in global security. What played out over the skies of Israel tonight and across the waters of the Gulf of Oman was not a news story. It was a turning point, the kind that gets a chapter in history books written decades from now. A night when the hardware of the old world order met the will of a new one, and the encounter resolved in a way that very few people in Western capitals were prepared to honestly anticipate. Iron Dome did not hold, the F-35 base did not survive intact, the carriers did not stay, and the world that emerges from this night is not the world that entered it. The debate that matters now is not whether Iran has proven something. It clearly has. The debate is what the proven capability of a self-reliant, strategically coherent Iran means for every other calculation being made in this region and beyond. Does it accelerate diplomacy because the cost of continued escalation has become undeniable? Or does it harden the positions of those who believe that the only response to demonstrated Iranian strength is escalation of their own? The trajectory of that debate will shape the Middle East and by extension the global energy and security architecture for the next decade at minimum. Where do you stand on this? Was tonight a demonstration of deterrence that ultimately serves stability, or does it represent a dangerous threshold being crossed that makes wider conflict more rather than less likely? Drop your honest assessment in the comments. The most substantive perspectives from this community always generate the best conversations. If this analysis gave you something that the mainstream coverage didn't, a framework, a number, a connection that changed how you're reading these events, share it with one person who needs it. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay close because the next update on this situation is already being built. The situation is moving fast, and so are we. Stay sharp.